In this lesson, we will determine the domain and range of functions. Our first question will be y equals the square root of x minus 6 plus 8. Please remember that domain is the values your x can take. Y is the values your range can take. Many times when you're working these questions, it's not always about what values the x can take, but you got to think about what values it cannot take. In this case, since we have a square root, we know that a square root could never be a negative number. So let's first determine what would make that square root a 0. Solving that for x, I get x is 6. Any value less than 6 would cause this square root to be negative. Since we cannot have the square root to be negative, the domain of this function, x would be greater or equal to 6. It can equal 6 because 6 does give you 0. It just cannot be anything smaller than 6 because that would give us a negative in our square root. Once we determine what our range, our domain is, we have to determine our range. Well, looking at what we already determined for a domain, putting 6 in, six minus 6 is 0. Square root of 0 is 0. Y is 8. Y could never be any value less than 8, because for it to be a value less than the 8, this would have to be a negative, which it can never be. As we increase the x, 7, 8, 9, 10, this value increases, which would increase the value of y. So my range would be the values of y where y is greater than or equal to 8. There's your domain and range for this first equation. Let's look at a second equation. H of x is 6x over x times x squared minus 25. Now again, it's not always what values can x take, what values can it not take. Anytime we have zeros in a denominator, we have to be worried about what values of x would make that denominator a 0. So I would set the x equal to 0 and the x minus 25 equal to 0. Remember, the x minus 25 can factor. Setting each of those at a 0, we determined that x could not equal 0, x could not equal negative 5, x could not equal 5. These three values would cause my denominator to be 0, which we cannot have. So your answer would be your domain, x cannot equal these values. Any other value x could take, just not those values. One third type. It could be the x squared, y equals 4x squared, or it might be switched and say x equals 4y squared. But whichever term you have squared is where you want to start. And since on this question my x is squared, I'm going to start talking about my domain first. Start thinking about values of x. If I put a 0 in, I get a 0 for y. I put a 1 in, I get 4 for y. I put a negative 1 in, I get a 4 for y. We determined that we could put any value in here for x, and we will get a value for y. So the domain of this function is x is a real number because we could put any value in for x. But my range. Well, think about the values we put in for x. No matter if I put a positive or negative value in here, when I square that positive or negative value, I am going to get a positive value. So no matter what I put in for x, y is going to be a positive number. So y would be greater than or equal to 0. Because again, if I square a number, it ends up positive. So y would never be negative. Y has to be greater than 0.